Well, welcome to the inaugural episode of the ArcFlash Data Center Podcast, sparking new ideas in the data center space. I'm Kevin Aboden.
And I'm Jabez Tan.
And what are we doing here, Jabez? This was a brilliant idea that you had that you came to me with, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on what we're trying to accomplish by launching a new podcast.
Yeah, Kevin, it's pretty simple. I wanted to provide a balanced, nuanced, and hopefully unbiased view on the state and most pressing topics affecting the data center and hyperscale cloud industry. I think we want to see our industry succeed, but we are also not naive cheerleaders nor doomsayers. What we believe is ultimately the best way for our industry to progress is by addressing and being transparent and honest with the challenges that we are facing. And so the goal here is not to do a podcast for the sake of doing a podcast, but really to share an insider perspective on the industry that you typically will not read or hear about in press releases, CNBC interviews, conference panels that will usually only focus on the positive aspects of the industry. And, I coming from that background, I've obtained this perspective from covering the space as an industry research analyst since 2011, so over 12 years now. And I'm now leading the data center and hyperscale cloud research practice at Structure Research. Kevin, curious to hear what your background is and what you bring to the table.
Sure. I mean, I've been studying the data center industry since 2007. It's been a long time. Started out at a real estate data company, so start studying all global real estate transactions, and then moving on to specializing just in data centers on the brokerage side. So doing a lot of global research there on what's going on in the market, capital flows, who's building, all that kind of thing. And now moved over to the operator side with EdgeConneX about a year and a half ago, and so that's been a fantastic move and just enjoying developing in all kinds of massive and tiny markets both around the world. So it's interesting to look at the industry from three different prisms, if you will. And I think we could compare notes on what we're seeing week by week.
Absolutely.
So what have you been seeing? I mean, this is a really red hot time in the market. I know we've been talking away from this podcast about a lot of different trends we've been keeping up with. What's on your radar right now?
I think what we're getting questions about the most from the research side is how is the impact of generative AI going to flow through into the demand for data center infrastructure? And by extension, how are the hyperscalers going to be part of this generative AI value chain, given that they do already have the scale, they do have the platform, the expertise. But then, there's a lot of specialized generative AI companies out there as well that are doing some really interesting things. Examples being like Palantir, for example, CoreWeave on the infrastructure side. So, and NVIDIA as well is they're creating not just the hardware, but the software side, this full stack solution to cater to these. And you have some pretty unique insights on that, Kevin, as well, given your lens. But yeah, that's basically what I've been hearing and focusing on.
Well, yeah, and I think the technology is really exciting, and I really am looking forward to how all the hyperscalers integrate into their current products because I think they're going to make those products much easier to use, much more valuable to use. I think a lot of times people have just moved to the cloud; they aren't sure which level to go on or what workflow to use when they first move. And so I think AI will help with that decision and also help the workflows work a lot better. I guess the part that I'm trying to process right now, and this is what we're getting asked a lot about on the operations side, is how do we deal with this rack density? Because I think this rack density has changed overnight. Most hyperscale builds, if you want to generalize, 8 to 10 kilowatts a rack, nothing too serious. And then going up to 20-ish, possibly in some cases. And now all of a sudden you're being asked 40, 50 kilowatts a rack is normal. And you're hearing first whispers of even beyond that, 80, 100, just crazy numbers we haven't seen before. I think we as a data center industry have to figure out how to accommodate these requests. And it's not going to be the simplest thing.
Yeah, and just to bring some color into what you just said, Kevin, when you were saying 8 to 10 kilowatts per rack for the hyperscalers, typical and we're talking about average density, right? You have some, throughout the entire sort of, they deploy 5, 10, 15, 20 megawatts of capacity within a data center. You'll have a range of hardware server gear that's, it could be network switches and routers that are lower density between 2 to 5 kW per rack. You have storage arrays that run between 5 and 6. You have higher density compute that runs 10 to 15 or even 20. And so like you were saying, blended average is between 8 to 12 kW per rack, which is what you're describing for your typical hyperscale customer. And one thing that I've noticed, and speaking with a lot of the other operators and people in the industry, is that once you hit a threshold of about 20 to 25 kW per rack of density, it's really inefficient to do that through an air-cooled setup. So whether you're doing hot aisle or cold aisle containment, you're still reaching a breaking point where it's no longer as efficient to cool these high-density servers with air-cooled facilities. What's your perspective on that, Kevin?
Well, it goes again with the rest of the industry has to do. As an industry, we have to figure out liquid cooling. I think it's been deployed few and far between in data center environments, and usually it's a very specialized case right now, and it's about to become mainstream. And so I think figuring that out, making sure we're using synthetic fluids and not racking up a water bill if it's not, especially if it's not closed loop for all the cooling in a building, then that's going to be a big issue too. I think too, this immersion cooling always seems like it's another 5 years away. Like it's not something that a lot of folks are taking seriously, but if we're talking 1,800 kilowatts a rack, I'm not sure how else you're going to cool that, even with direct chip. So it's going to be very interesting to see if that becomes a reality for several more data centers. You have to think about all that around raised floor and probably on a slab for that, or reinforcing the floor for those kind of tanks. But that'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, and to your point, a lot of the hyperscalers today have shifted from a raised floor setup to a slab floor design, right? Am I sort of hitting the right key there on what hyperscalers are deploying today?
I think that happened a while ago.
Mm. Yeah.
Happened a while ago. I'm just curious too. I mean, where are we going to find all this power? It's become commonplace to request for training large language models that we need to, company access. We need 100 megawatts in such and such area or this part of the world. 100 megawatts. All right. We're still struggling. I think a lot of times 20, 50 megawatts regularly, and we're able to achieve that. But a lot of cities as an industry, we've run them out of power. So it'll be interesting to see, okay, where are we going to find this 100 megawatts all over the place?
Yeah. And I think the questions that we were talking about around this topic is, we're often getting asked, like, how is generative AI demand going to impact the data center requirements in tier one markets? And people are always saying, what is that incremental demand, or how big is that demand coming in from generative AI infrastructure in like tier one markets like Singapore or Tokyo or Sydney? And my view on it, I'm not sure what your view is, Kevin, but my view is that a lot of that is not going to happen in tier one cities because you're land constrained there, you're power constrained, electricity costs are not the cheapest in tier one markets. And so what you'll, I think, see is what's actually played out in the US market, where a lot of the hyperscalers have self-built a lot of their data center campuses in the middle of nowhere, right? Omaha, Nebraska, Papillon, Des Moines, Iowa, places that I haven't even heard of.
No offense to anyone who lives in those towns, right? No offense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been living in the US for more than half of my life, and I've never heard of some of these places. And that, I think, speaks to the fact that that's where all the training is going to take place. That's where all the large GPU super dense clusters are going to be deployed, is in these low cost, economics will drive this location strategy. And I think what people are trying to think about is, okay, once you've trained the models, where does that, you have to start deploying these applications closer to the end user at the metro edge. And that will happen in these tier one, tier two markets. And that will happen on the inference side is what we're seeing.
Absolutely. I think the question is how dense those inference models are going to be when they get deployed, right? Those workloads are going to be 40, 50 kilowatts a rack, probably. Maybe they'll be scaled down. I hear early returns say they're going to be scaled down a little bit, but they're still going to be much denser than what's expected so far. And those are going to be what's in the dense urban areas, right? With all the population and the eyeballs working on those apps. I think it's interesting because you mentioned the U.S. Midwest, and that seems to be the early case for a lot of these LLM training data centers is that they're going to be in these locations, just low cost power but available power, and then also the incentives are starting to crop up again as a huge talking point, not only state level, but I've been hearing a lot about local incentives. So different counties, cities who are willing to roll out big packages just to get that development underway. And those sales tax abatements are huge when you're spending so much more on high level compute as well as all the other infrastructure that's going to be necessary. So I think that's going to be a bigger talking point than it has been some time. Is not only the available power, but what incentives that can be extracted, if you will. And I think some of these areas that have been overlooked as data center locations too, not just in the Midwest US, but I've been having conversations around the Nordics lately. You know, the renewable power, um, a lot of localized incentives as well are going to be very helpful to get that off the ground. Also, I know we've talked in the past. You know, certain markets around Asia. I think certain cities in India tick the box there because now the power grid is much more robust than it had been in the past. And we talked about Johor in Malaysia. I know it's a favorite topic for both of us. That the land's available, the power's available, proximity to Singapore works out well for a lot of these cases.
Yeah, and also I think in some lesser known markets in Asia, I think Perth comes to mind, given its subsea cable connectivity story
Mm-hmm.
there.
Mm-hmm.
Low cost of power, lots of availability of power, potential for renewable energy projects there as well, or tethering to renewable projects in proximate locations to Perth. And then you look at Japan, where you have most of the data center infrastructure today centered around Tokyo and Osaka. And the Japanese government has already come out publicly and saying they're trying to decentralize the focus on just Tokyo and Osaka. They don't want all of the data center infrastructure to be just concentrated in those two locations. And so I think a lot of the there's an interesting location in Japan called the Kyushu Fukuoka region that is on the western side of Japan. And that's really, if you look at that on the map, it's very proximate to Busan. And Busan is important because that's also an aggregation point for submarine cables. And so, with the economics, like you mentioned, Kevin, earlier, not just incentives, but power costs, electricity costs, availability of power, I think, as long as you check those boxes, I think those markets tend to be very attractive when you start to think about, okay, do I really want to be training all these models on US soil and then pay all that connectivity costs to um, those egress costs to transfer all of those applications to other markets across multiple regions, right?
So you're advocating for sort of a diversified architecture where these models are developed.
I think so. I think not just on the training side, but I think on the inference side is also something that's really interesting to me because there's been in every market across the world, there has been carrier hotels, like typically between 1 to 3 carrier hotels per major market that really act as the aggregation point for networks, carriers, telcos, internet exchange points, peering exchanges. And all those data centers are either super old, 10, 15, 20 years old. They're at capacity, so they have no more space and power left to sell. They're aging, and so what do? You can't just tear it down because there's so much production workloads and critical infrastructure that's running in these facilities. And so what I think may happen is you'll likely see a next iteration of these carrier hotels, which we like to call cloud hotels, that will eventually house these higher density. We used to have cloud on ramps inside carrier hotels. I think we'll start to have AI on ramps in these cloud hotels that, like you pointed out, will cater to that higher density inference aspect of generative AI.
And that's going to be the change, right? In between one of the big changes in between the training and the inference. I mean, that need for fiber to actually deploy. Whereas when you're developing the model, one or two networks, you're probably fine. But once you're actually deploying, you're in production. A lot of people need access to that. That's going to be an entirely different story. And that's interesting because I think a lot of those carrier hotels as we know them in their current configuration, they do need to become this cloud hotel, as you mentioned, because their rack densities will not support anything even close to this. So I think those buildings could integrate into something else, right? Maybe there's the standard carrier hotel, and then tethering into that in a building next door is something specifically built for density, right? I'm just thinking out loud. Maybe
Yeah,
it's a
and
thing.
I think you make a great point because the purpose of these cloud hotels, I think, is not to replace carrier hotels, but to your point, it's going to be an extension of carrier hotels and be tethering into the network density within these carrier hotels. And I think that's also true. I'm not sure if you recall, but there was once a Gartner quote that said, the edge is going to eat the cloud, and something about the cloud is
Right.
doomed because of the edge.
Right.
And we've always thought that it's not as simple as making that statement. It's a more of a nuance how that's going to play out. And the edge has naturally developed as an extension of the cloud. And cloud providers or hyperscale platforms are deploying edge versions of cloud regions and tethering that back into parent regions. Right, Kevin? I'm not sure if you're seeing the same things as well.
Absolutely. There needs to be consistency across the whole portfolio more than there has been in the past, because now you're running a greater array of applications and everything has to function properly, right? So you're you're required to do things more consistently.
Yeah. And I think the great thing about this podcast series that we're starting, Kevin, is you're not just going to hear from myself and Kevin, even though I hope you enjoy hearing from both of us. But we love to bring in guests and people across the industry, a diverse set of people, not just the CEOs, but a good subset, good cross section where you get to hear some really good insights, not just from us, but from these other industry participants. Some of them will be really good friends of ours that we've known for many years, and some will be new faces. And so I'm really excited to embark on this journey, Kevin, with you, and hopefully all of you guys listening will join us as well.
Absolutely right, Jabez. This is going to be exciting. And if you have any interest in appearing on this podcast, give either of us a shout through any of the usual channels. And we look forward to chatting with everyone soon.
Yeah, you can find us on LinkedIn. If you want to meet us in person, Kevin and I will both be at our Structure Researchers flagship event in Toronto in October 4th to 5th in Toronto. It's called Infrastructure Summit. Look forward to seeing you guys there if you are able to make it. But if not, we'd love to connect with you virtually as well.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone. See you next week.